Okay. The nation Israel is the one now on whom the 490s depend. That is basically because it was granted through Moses, but Moses didn't want to be God's mouthpiece. It's also because it's harder, according to the trial, for a nation to vote enough for God versus an individual. Now, really what ends up happening, as you're going to see here, is that the added criterion of national voting, remember we had these 40-year voting periods, 70-year voting periods for believers. All right, you had your first one occurring here between 490 and 560. Then Noah votes positively in the believer voting window between 1540 and 610. And you have Abraham voting just at the end of Noah's personal 490, which extended basically time. Then you have another voting window that occurs here, during which Moses votes. And as we keep going on, because Moses voted during the believer voting window, Israel, a nation of believers, when it first comes out, about 1/3 of them were actually Hebrew, and the rest of them were converts. KJV calls that mixed multitudes. It's about 6 million people, including the kids, 2 million adults. The 6 million is an estimate based on how many kids each person had. This whole nation now is charged with a greater voting role than before, but is still derives from a personal 490 covenant. Now, that makes it harder for time to continue. This is the precedence. I'm getting ahead a little bit, but I need to show you the relevance. This is the precedence for the rapture for us now. Because what happens here, as you're going to see, Israel flubs it. Israel fails. Israel does not vote enough for God. That's why the temple ends up getting destroyed and the nation goes down. All those rules in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 are based on Israel as a voting nation. Because Israel fails, that's one thing in the trial that didn't get completed. When Christ invents church, that's also a corporate criterion of voting. Now, it's based on a personal, somebody like a Moses every 490 years within the church. Okay, has to be there, but also the church has to vote enough. Now, obviously, then, the strategy that Satan would use is to get the national, it's not really a nation church, but it's a body, okay? A body of people all over the world now. And then in Israel's case, it was a body of people in a particular geographical location. All right, but this is a body of church. Both cases, deriving again, the precedence is from Israel. In both cases, the body has to vote enough positively or time ends. That's the precedence for the rapture. In other words, the rapture is nothing new. It's just a continuation of old rules. The first rule was some individuals, starting with Adam, and at this point in the timeline we're looking at Moses. All right? But there were also the 70-year believer voting periods, which in the Mosaic law at this point become called sabbatical years, and you'll notice that there are 70 of them. Now, in cell A2, if you were to click on that cell and look up item 9, click up that cell, download the Word doc, and upload it, and then look on item 9 in the Word doc. I think it begins around page 14 of the Word doc. You will see in item 9 a tracking of the voting periods, and you will also see in item 9 how God calculated the sabbatical years to literally buy, the 50-year voting periods that ensue Like right now, for example, because I got one on the screen, between 3100 and 3150 is a world voting period. That's depicted by Jubilee in the Mosaic Law. Because the final end of time ends with a 50-year voting period by the world. All right, and I'll be getting into that hopefully in a later video. But the point is that there's a 50-year voting period. It's literally purchased by the Jews observing the sabbatical years. And item 9 of this Word doc that you can click on in cell A2 and download, item 9, which begins usually about page 14 of that Word doc, I think, will show you exactly the math of how the 70 sabbatical years in a 490 purchase the 50-year period between, that marks the end of a 1,000-year unit. That's how you know the voting criteria for the whole nation Israel was that important. That's why they went out. They didn't observe the sabbatical years. And what God basically does is restore the accounting in Daniel 9, which we're going to get to. I don't know how much I can cover it because this is just about Genesis. But that's the point to get here. That not only is there a person that has to mature by every, row 94 here, this is yet another contiguous 490 deadline. Somebody had to mature by that deadline in order for time to continue. But now there's a new wrinkle. Nation Israel must vote. The nation, the body of believers must vote. And this time it's a specific body of believers. Okay, in church it's going to be anybody who believes in Christ in church. But here in Israel it was a specific body in a specific geographical location. So understand that's the precedence for the rapture. The rapture is just another variation on the same time accounting system. Time was always able to end immediately if the votes were too bad. That's the precedence we saw from the flood. And that same idea continues. It just changes flavors as the covenants advance in time. But the same rule is there. God is consistent. Okay. So now we're at Israel and its role and how the time shifts, and that's what we're going to see in the next episode. All right. Let's look at how this time thing works now that it's been added with this wrinkle. The goal is that Israel has to vote for God and observe the Mosaic Law or time ends. Now, as with anybody else, Israel's going to make lots of mistakes, so there is a sort of roster of things that if it does wrong, there are warnings and all of that. But it's a pretty drastic thing for time to end, so there's a certain amount of backup that's given and a certain amount of leeway for them to repent or change their mind and get back into the spiritual life. However, one of the things that is not allowed is for God to be rejected as king. So now the cursor is on row 97 and cell E97. In 1050 BC, God was rejected as king in favor of Saul. Now, because Samuel was still there, and because Moses is the real origin of the 490, which doesn't end until 950, as you see in row 108, something can be done about this, because the basic rule is that a time grant protects. And Moses had met that by the end of the 6th contiguous qualifying, back-to-back 490s from Adam, non-intercalated. So in 1050 BC, because Moses also met the year 3000 qualifier, all right? In 1050 BC, which is 10 years after Abraham's personal 1000 went out, but Moses 1000 is still running, and Moses 490 is still running. All right? Because of that, and only because of that, time doesn't end. So you see, it's very complicated. You got the criterion for granting time is based on back-to-back 490s, and it's also based on back-to-back 1000s. And basically, if the 490 deadline intervenes before the 1000-year deadline, time ends. Okay, but it's based on the personal grant to somebody, and that runs 490 years from the time that person was given the grant. All right, and there's different benchmarks, too, as you're going to see with David. If those 490s for the persons are still running, and they met within the qualifying historical periods, then the intercalated real history can continue to go on. So that's why you can have a civilization 1000, 3000, beginning in 3100 year from Adam, lasting until 3150, so that there can be a voting period. Otherwise, there would have been no Israel, and there would have been no temple. That's all protected because Moses is actually the grantee for the 490 and the 1000. Similarly, Israel is protected for that reason also, even when time should end. All right? Israel rejects God as king in 1050. The clock should have just run out then. At this point in 1050, it's like, okay, then the only reason time continues, because it can't continue due to Israel anymore. She abrogated her 490 grant in 1050. She abrogated it. Okay, but Moses' personal 490 is still running until 950. And Moses 1000 is still running, but it's running to a later date. So 950 is really the deadline for somebody else. See, in row 108, 950 is really the deadline for some other person to be super matured, since Israel has rejected her 490 covenant. Now that's a precedence for the rapture too. If too many believers in church reject God, the rapture has to occur for the wrong reason. It's not the same as the rapture doctrine you hear about in Christianity. It's, there's some similarity between the two, but this dark side of the rapture they're not explaining. The rapture can occur at the wrong time because people rejecting God just like Israel did. So the national covenant that was given in 1440 BC is basically rejected in 1050. What's God going to do? Well, and you're going to need this because Daniel 9 is based on it. Moses' personal 490 is still running until 950 BC. So the goal is, can God find somebody, some human, some person, and super mature him enough, and then all the time grants go through him, and he will graft Israel in through that person. That person is going to be David. And it's because there was a David, there would be a Christ. Because Israel had rejected God in 1050 BC. So this covenant here, where the 490 shifts due solely to Moses to Israel, is technically abrogated by Israel, the nation, in 1050 BC. So God's task is to develop a king of Israel, because that way he can graft Israel back in. Develop a king of Israel who personally super matures enough so that the time can go through him. Now notice, he has to be a king of Israel for Israel to come back in. Israel was the grantee of the 490s at this point. So there's nobody else as a person, unless it's the king of Israel, who can get the 490s to continue time. In other words, at this point in history, all future time has to go through somebody who's a king of Israel. That's real important. So you got the first David and the last David. All time hinges on those two persons. And you're going to see this very dramatically. That's why you have a shift in the way the 490s and the 1000s are counted with David. Okay? So now, let's look at David's dates, because David gets 6 time grants. First of all, notice that David is born 10 years after Israel rejects Saul as king. David becomes king in stages. He becomes king at age 30. He was super mature by then. In 1010. There is a 490 that tracks to 1010 BC. 490 years later, it really affects Israel's history, not as much as the later ones, though. There is another 490 that David gets granted based on the date when he became king of all Israel, late in 1004 BC. When you're using your subtractions, count it as 1003, because it's very late in the year. It might have even been 25 Kislev. I'm not sure what date it was, but it was late in the Jewish year. Okay, there is a third 490, and there's also going to be a 1000, but I'll talk about the 1000s in a minute. There's a third 490 that tracks from 970 BC when David retired as king. There is a fourth 490 that tracks from 963 BC when David really died. 1 Kings 6:1 tells you when David died, but scholars can't read it properly, and that's why they misdate it. I go into that in mirroring.htm. I cover that in my David links of the mirroring.htm webpage. But just get the idea for now. We got four 490s we're going to track. From 1010 BC, from late 104 BC, from 970 BC, and 963 BC. Now God also granted David, because all time is hinging on him now, because of the nature of the contract being abrogated, because it's a national contract, because it was abrogated, because David gets grafted in as king of Israel, all time has to go through him now. And only a king of Israel can continue time at this point. So through David, the time grant goes from 1010, from 103, from 970, from 963. 4 separate 490 time grants. There are also 1,000-year time grants. And they go from late 1004. 1,000 years later, Christ will be born based on this deadline. Okay? The second 1,000-year time grant that God uses is benchmarked to David's retirement date. 1,000 years after 970 BC, the Lord will actually die on the cross in real history. There is a third 1,000-year grant, which is the end of allotted time, because this is part of the prophecy that goes back to the Exodus. The 963 BC, 1,000 years after that, is the end date that God uses in Daniel 9's prophecy. God uses solar years. Scholars keep using lunar years when they read Daniel 9. That's why they get it wrong. Okay, you're supposed to use solar years. It'd be 37 AD is the deadline that God uses. Christ would have had at that point 40 years of rule, just like David had 40 years of rule from united kingship, because Christ has to be born a king. In order for time to continue, a king of Israel has to continue time. So the first David is awarded time, and the last David has to be born on time in order to continue time. So he's born on time 1,000 years after David becomes king, Christ becomes born. 1,000 years after David dies was the end of what Christ's allotted time could be. But the Jews reject Christ, so he dies instead 7 years early in 1000th anniversary of 970, which is 30 AD. All right, which is the 1000th anniversary of David's retirement from kingship. So the last David retires at 1,000 years when the first David retires. The first David retires successful. The last David retires successful. The first David basically died retires rejected in favor of Solomon. There's all this civil war that went on as a result. And, of course, the last David dies rejected also. But in terms of the time award and fulfilling God's requirement for supermaturation, both the first David and the last David obviously met that requirement. Okay, now we're going to go through the significance of these 490-year grants to David, because Israel rejected God as king in 1050. So God raises a king to continue time, to Messiah. The most important things about it, well, everything I've said about the intervening of the 1000 and the 490 and the voting periods, all displays in Bible, if you track the dates the Bible gives you about temple history, specifically after the first temple was destroyed and its reconstruction, especially that period. And if you track the dating from David to Christ, it's really dramatic. So let's hope I can do a good job of explaining it. Okay, as we saw, David becomes king in late 1004 BC. We're treating that as 1003 in the worksheet for math purposes. Makes the math work better. And Israel had rejected God, so now everything's going through David. Meanwhile, Moses' personal 490 is still running. That's why there could be a David. Moses' personal 490 extends beyond the beginning of the third millennium, which Moses also got, third millennium from Adam, including the voting period, which ended 3150 from Adam. Moses' 490 covered all that, and of course his 1000 goes beyond it even further. But the 490 has to be met by somebody else by 950 in order for time to continue. Now we have this complicated situation where, because Israel rejected God in 1050, and the time grants were supposed to go through Israel from 1440 forward, we got this complicated situation where there has to be a king of Israel getting a personal grant, but there also has to be something corporate that gets the grant. In other words, the corporate grant to Israel depends on David, but it can't actually go to Israel because Israel rejected God. This is a very big diplomatic problem in God granting the world more time to live. So the temple is promised to David in 2 Samuel 7. The temple is for Israel, and so the temple's building gets the 490 grant. That's why Daniel 9 talks about the temple, because the temple is promised to David. David's king of Israel. Israel thus gets grafted in that way, and the temple, as well as a son, a king, being promised to David, Israel can go on living, so therefore the world can go on living, so long as there is a temple living. Because the temple stands for the corporate requirement that didn't actually get abrogated, because then God would not have kept his promise from back here to here. So that's how God solves the problem. Okay, so there has to be a temple by the time Moses 490 ends. And there is, at the last minute. It's 1 Kings 8:1. It was built on, it was dedicated either on 1 Ethanim, which is the Rosh Hashanah, or it was, Rosh Hashanah being a holy day, it might have been actually dedicated on 2 Ethanim. My bet is that it was dedicated on 1 Ethanim. I mean, it's holy. Temple reconstruction began the 3rd year after David died. That's in 1 Kings 6:1, which everybody misreads. But there was all kinds of delays, and Solomon kind of got wacko and started building his other stuff. But it did get dedicated at the last minute, right when Moses 490 runs out. Okay, so now we have the 490 running from the temple, but it's really based on David. So God will be tracking in the Bible both the Davidic personal 490 deadlines and the temple deadlines from here on out. And in fact, post-cross, Satan still tracks to the temple deadlines. That's what's so odd. But I cover that in my How Satan Deploys Islam video, so I'm going to leave that out here. I mean, we're sort of beyond Genesis now, but all of this started in Genesis. The rules are based in Genesis. So until you see the whole timeline, it's kind of hard to understand why they are called why you can call them Time Lords from Genesis forward, Genesis 5. Now we're into Israel's timeline. We're into the Jubilee, we're into the sabbatical years, we're into the Mosaic Law, and so long as Israel keeps that law, there will be a temple standing. If it violates the law too much, there will not be a temple standing, and that's what Satan tries to do now. He tries to destroy the temple. Of course, now that the temple is destroyed because church exists, Satan's trying to rebuild it. But I digress. Okay, 950 BC, temple dedicated. There are all these kings that follow Solomon. The kingdom splits into the 2 tribes, in 10 tribes, and then you have, the usurpation, what they call Israel is really Samaria, and then you have Judah. Judah continues. Samaria is basically taken over by a usurper who's the legal line lasts of the usurper, because God granted him that at first, but he didn't keep to God. That lasts for 4 generations, and then after that it's all usurpers in the 10 tribes of Samaria. That's why they go out in 722 BC. But here we're going to track the kings of Judah. So the worksheet beginning in row 110 is tracking the kings of Judah. And, what happened to them. And it's not particularly significant history. What's significant about what happens during this time is that the word goes lost inside the temple, that the temple priests are pretty apostate. So with the result that maybe only, like Hezekiah and Josiah finally celebrate Passover. I mean, it's really bad. Okay? And they don't observe the sabbatical years. That's the indictment. So by 586 BC, God takes them out. Now, God takes them out in a very remarkable way. This is recorded. You can see the verses on the screen in the gray. God takes them out to remind them why. All right? There are 57 days from the beginning of Passover to Pentecost. Okay, they count, the modern Jewish counting of the Omer is wrong. You begin the counting of the Omer on the last day of Passover, unless it's a Saturday, and then you have to begin the count the following day. But you got the 2 high Sabbaths, but if the actual last day of Passover is a Saturday, is a Friday rather, then you have to delay a day before you begin the counting of the Omer. So it's normally 57 days. Okay? 57 days after Pentecost is 9th Av. God is mirroring back the 57 days they didn't observe correctly with 57 days to the destruction of the temple. He will do that again in 70 AD. That's what he does here. That's what he does then. The actual 70 AD destruction of the temple began on Passover nominally. It was nominal Passover. They hadn't intercalated that year. But it was still based on their own calendar that they knew. It was 57 days that Titus began on Passover, the destruction of Jerusalem, and he finished the destruction of the temple on 9th or 10th Av, according to their calendar that year of 70 AD. So God does it twice. All right? This was the first time, 586 BC. Now, when 49 years had elapsed, representing the sabbatical years missed, Daniel then prays for the temple's restoration. That's 538 BC, and you can tell that from the dating in Daniel. A year later, really pretty much immediately God answered that with Cyrus. And so a year later, the second temple's foundation is laid on the 24th of Kislev, and in Jewish time, the 25th of Kislev begins at sundown on the 24th. That presages Christ's birth. And God uses very witty wording, which I don't know why Christendom missed it. I guess you'd have to know the timeline or something to figure it out. But you can see the verses. It's in Haggai 2, 18, 20, and 23. That's the Lord's birth date being presaged. And you knew it would be a birth date. At this point, when the second temple foundation is laid, you know the Lord is going to be born on 25 Kislev, 4 BC, because there has to be a king born to continue the timeline, because that's the 1000th anniversary of David's commencement of kingship. So from this point forward, Israel knows when Messiah will be born exactly.